This is the last in a series of shiurim that deals with the Mabul. We started with the stuff leading up to the Mabul. We had one or two shiurim on that. We had a shiur on the Mabul itself. Last week we had a shiur on the aftermath of the Mabul, and today really really is the concluding concluding shiur in this whole series on the Mabul, and then we're going to move on to new things. There are I don't like to do this. I usually like to have one central theme that runs through our entire learning in a session. But the way the text worked out, it didn't allow for that so much. So we have what I see as two and maybe even three and maybe even four distinct topics to focus on. Some of them a little bit more intense, and some of them a little bit less so. Okay, so the first thing that I would start with, and again, for those of you who don't have your phones on, your cameras on, please turn them on. We like to see each other. We like to know who we're talking to and who's responding and things like that. It makes for a very different culture. Thank you very much. Okay, so what we're focusing on today is really starting with chapter 9, pasuk 8, perek tet pasuk chet, and from there going through the end of perek tet through the end of chapter 9. The first topic in there, is the rainbow. Probably the most famous symbol that we have of the flood. But it's sort of a misnomer because the rainbow is not the center of that. And we'll see that passage there really breaks into two halves. And when we focus on the two halves, each one of them brings us a little bit of a surprise. The first half really focuses on covenant. Hashem basically promises, and we heard Hashem speaking to himself earlier that he's not going to do this again. But in the opening of this section, starting with chapter 9, pasuk 8, perek tet pasuk chet, so we have 4 or 5 psukim that really speak about Brit, about covenant, and that is really the focus of that section. You find that in pasuk tet as an example, pasuk 9, Hineni mekim et briti itchem, I am going to establish, and I'm going to change that translation in a minute, my covenant with you. He repeats it again in pasuk Yud Aleph, pasuk 11. Okay, so we have twice in a span of 3 psukim the word Brit coming up. The word Brit will come up a number of times afterwards, but that first half of that passage there really focuses on Brit, and there does seem to be a lot of repetition. And I have tried many times over the years to try to understand why there's a lot of repetition. I've only been partially successful. There is some kind of a structure in there. There's certainly some kind of chiastic structure in there. I haven't quite nailed it down precisely, but there's some element of that. But the first half of this really speaks about Brit, about covenant. And I wanted to focus on not just the word Brit, but on the word mekim Brit. It appears both in pasuk 9 and in pasuk 11. Mekim et briti itchem. The word that is used throughout Tanakh to describe establishing a covenant is lichrot Brit, to cut a covenant. And at some point later on, we can talk about why the word cutting is used. It's sort of like the equivalent in English of cutting a deal, right? So we'll speak at some point about why cutting is an important verb to use here, but that's usually the verb for establishing a covenant. The word here is lahakim Brit, and lahakim does not mean to establish in this case. I believe that the word lahakim comes from the word, is related to the word likayim, to fulfill. And what God is promising over here is not that he's going to establish a new covenant with Noah, right? There's no new covenant here. God is going to fulfill his previous covenant through Noah. Okay? There's a hint to this already before the Mabul starts. If you were to just turn your pages back to chapter 6, Pasuk 18, you'll see the first hint of this. The first hint of this is when Hashem is first telling Noah to prepare for the Mabul. He says, "V'hakimoti ed briti itach." So this is not a reaction to the Mabul. This is part of the plan in advance, that I will fulfill my covenant with you. And the question is, what covenant is he talking about? Because we haven't heard of any covenants in the first 5 chapters of Sefer Breisheet. The word doesn't appear. This is the first time the word appears. In the story of the Mabul, it appears in Perek Vav, and again, as we just saw twice, in Perek Tet. And the question is, what are we talking about? And here I'm going to just raise a suggestion. That suggestion is that there is a covenant that pre-exists the Mabul. It's never spelled out explicitly. It's never identified. It's implicit. There's an implicit covenant that God has with people. And that covenant is, I created you. I'm going to tolerate some of your mistakes. That's the implicit covenant that God has with humanity. And then things happened that forced God to sort of question or reevaluate that. And his response is, no, I am still going to stick to that. I'm still going to tolerate people's misdeeds. But I'm not going to be able to do that with all of humanity. I will only be able to do that through Noah and those who come from Noah. Right? But there's an implicit covenant beforehand, and the covenant only becomes explicit right here in the story of Noah. It turns out, and there's a lot to say about this, and I'm not going to say it now. Well, it'll unfold in our study of Sefer Breisheet, where Brit comes up over and over again as a very important element. But it turns out that between Sefer Breisheet and Sefer Shmot and Sefer Vayikra, there is an unfolding concept of what covenant means. So the first covenant is implicit, and then it becomes explicit, and then it goes through another shift, and then it goes through another shift after that, and it goes through another shift after that, meaning the concept of covenant starts very primitive. It's not even explicit. It's just sort of implied in everything that the text says, and then eventually it becomes more and more explicit. And it's a process that goes on really through close to the end of Tanakh. And there is an evolving notion of what covenant means. What I just suggested over here in terms of what hakimoti means, that I'm going to fulfill it through you, it turns out that this isn't the first, well, this is the first time it happened, but it's not the only time that it happened. Because after the sin of the golden calf, God threatens to destroy Israel. And he says, but my covenant I'm going to fulfill through you, Moshe. Meaning, I made a covenant with Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. I made a covenant with the patriarchs. I'm not canceling that covenant, but I'm not going to be able to fulfill it with the masses of Israel. I will fulfill it through you and those who come from you. Moshe rejects that, and Hashem has to rework that stuff. But when Hashem threatens that, there's a model for it. The model for it is Noah. right? That he did it once before, he's willing to do it again. Okay, and that's why it becomes a very, very real threat for Moshe, because it's something that Hashem has done in the past and is prepared to do again. So the first half of this section, I see there are hands raised. I just want to finish this section before we take some comments and questions. The focus is on covenant, on Brit, but the twist is Hakimoti, right? I will fulfill. I will uphold, right? Really, I will uphold the covenant through you and your descendants, right? The covenant that was implicit is now explicit, and it will be upheld through you, and everybody else is gone. And that's the first half of this passage. The second half of the passage introduces a different angle on this. And there's a lot more to say, but I don't know how to say it. So the second half of this introduces, and somebody in their comments on the Google Doc actually pointed this out, and that's the word oat. The second half of the covenant focuses on this of this passage focuses on the sign, the oat, the sign of the covenant, right? The rainbow. We'll spend a few minutes talking about the rainbow, but the word oat comes up over and over and over again, starting with Pasuk 12, Yud Beit, Zot, Ot Habrit. Here's the sign of the covenant. It comes up again in the next Pasuk, in Yud Gimel. It comes up again in the very closing Pasuk, in Yud Zayin. So 3 times in the span of that section. The focus really, I wouldn't say that Brit has been replaced by the sign of the Brit, but Brit has been augmented by the sign of the Brit, because the word Brit keeps coming up over and over again all throughout the passage. It's introduced before there's a sign for the Brit, and then Hashem introduces the sign. Okay? Somebody asked on the Google Doc, and it's a great question, why does God need a sign to remember? Right? The way this is phrased, if you were to take a look at, for example, Pasuk 13, Pasuk Yud Gimel, Et kashti natati be'anan. I placed the bow in the clouds. Vayitala ot brit beini uvein haaretz. It's going to be the sign of the covenant between me and the land. V'haya ba'anani anan al haaretz. So when I bring my clouds over the land, v'nirata keshet be'anan, the rainbow will be seen in the clouds. V'zacharti et briti, and through that I will remember the covenant asher beini uveinechem, that's between me and you. Right? Why does Hashem need a sign of a covenant? You know, I was under the impression that Hashem remembers things. It turns out that you look later on in the Torah, you actually find many, many times when the word remembering is associated with God. God remembers. God remembers.
It's also written someplace, שדיברה תורה בלשון בני אדם.
Okay, so it could be Dibra Torah b'lashon b'nei Adam, but sometimes it's harder to justify than in other places. But it turns out that it certainly the phrase appears multiple times in Vayikra, at the end of Vayikra, when Hashem threatens all sorts of terrible things if Bnei Yisrael don't fulfill their half of the Brit. And he says, "V'zacharti et Briti," I will remember. Okay, does that imply that when terrible things are happening to Bnei Yisrael, then he had forgotten? Or when Hashem sees what's happening to Bnei Yisrael in Egypt, Vayizkor Elokim et Brito et Abraham et Yitzchak et Yaakov. Does that mean that up until that point, while there was suffering, he had forgotten? It comes up many, many times. So it could
Robert,
be.
I had asked that question, but I wasn't asking about God remembering, because we see that throughout the Tanakh. I was actually asking, why does Hashem need the keshet to be reminded?
Yes. Okay. So So first of all, I just wanted to point out that the notion of God remembering does appear, and it appears in many, many places, certainly in the Torah, in the Chumash. I didn't check in the rest of Tanakh, but certainly in the Chumash it appears multiple times. The sign, so usually the sign of a covenant is for us, right? Like God gave Shabbat to Bnei Yisrael as a sign of a covenant between him and them. Okay, then that's towards the end of Sefer Shemot, and that's the sign that for us, right? So you could argue, and I don't think it's a big stretch. You could argue that the sign is not really for God. God doesn't need Alexa to remind him of the covenant, right? He doesn't need a note on his calendar to remind him of the covenant, right? But when we see that, we know that whatever is going on in the world, God remembers. That's a sign to us, and it's phrased, right? It's phrased that Hashem sees the sign, but Hashem doesn't really need to see the sign. It's really for us. Here, though, it's phrased as if it's a reminder to Hashem. It's reassuring, but all of this is a reassurance to people. The fact that Hashem tells this to Noach and his sons means that the sign is really meant, right? So that they should know that when there's a rainbow, that means that Hashem is reminded of his Brit with humanity. I'm going to make just one other quick comment about this, and there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of Hasidic literature on the bow and the shape of the bow and the colors of the bow and why all those things are significant. I'm going to point out one thing and how it's relevant here, and it sort of opens up a window into a lot of other things later on in the Torah. God's revelation to humanity usually takes place in one of two forms. It's either through fire or through water. Okay, so here we see it, right? His revelation of himself to humanity is through water. His revelation later on in Sodom is through fire. In Egypt, the revelation, at least part of it, comes through the fire and the ice coming together. Okay, so it's both. Har Sinai is a revelation of fire. Eliyahu Hanavi is a revelation of fire, but there are other places we have revelations of water. Those are generally the two forms. And truth is, they are not only embedded in Tanakh, they are embedded in Western culture. When we think, you go to an insurance company and you want to insure your house, and they insure you against everything except for acts of God. Okay, unless you're living in California, the two primary acts of God are either a volcano or a lightning strike or something like that, which is revelation of fire, or a hurricane or a tsunami or something else, right? The flooding, right? An act of God, and what these things are, and I think that. So it's not only it's embedded in Western culture, and the reason why God's revelation, I think, comes through these two things. These are two fundamental elements without which human civilization could not exist. We can't exist without water. You just can't live without water. And civilization would not exist without fire. I mean, you can't make things, you can bake things, you can't cook, right? The creative process is, so we need fire and we need water. But when they get out of control, we are powerless to stop them. And that's the revelation of God. The revelation of God is through the very things that we need for our very survival and sustenance that seem to get out of control. So we have two modes of revelation. And the rainbow is a combination of those two. It's the sun shining its rays through the water vapor. So the rainbow is a dual revelation. It's not a revelation of destruction. It's a revelation of beauty. And it's that thing of beauty that we see that reminds us that God is interested in making the world a better place for everybody, not in destroying it. Right? So we have a double revelation there, and that double revelation reminds us of God's core goal in creating this world. He wants the world to exist. He wants to sustain the world. He doesn't want to bring about revelation through destruction. Sometimes it becomes necessary. Okay, so there were some hands up, and now there are more hands up. We're going to start with Rose, and then move on to Ruth, and then to Rona. Go ahead.
So, Rabbi, with respect to the rainbow, I read that Ibn Ezra said that Hashem made the atmospheric conditions appropriate, like physically, for this rainbow to appear. However, most of the other Chazals, like Hirsch, disagree, and they say that the rainbow suggests that no matter how hopeless situations are, Hashem will always lead us to eventual positive ultimate goal, and we will vanquish the bad times. So that's Shimshon Hirsch and many others. Ibn Ezra was an outlier.
Okay. It turns out that Ibn Ezra raises a very interesting question. Okay. Ibn Ezra, for those who don't know, he was a very worldly man with an extensive education in secular knowledge. Really unusual for his time. Like maybe not unusual for a person living in Spain, but there's so many fields that he was a master of, and he raises the question as a philosophical question. I don't know if rainbows existed before the Mabul or not.
No, I don't know.
Right? Was the rainbow created after the Mabul, or was it just given? It was always there and was given significance.
Well, that's kind of what he implies, that Hashem created it.
And he discusses both possibilities. Okay, Ruth, you're up next.
So I have a few points. The first one is, why is he even using the word brit here? A brit in every other place is an agreement or a condition between two parties, and there are not two parties here. He even says beini uveinechem, but the Noach or humanity or all of living things don't do anything. There's no condition put upon them. God says, this is what I'm going to do, and you guys, nothing. You have to do nothing. And every other brit that we ever meet in the whole of Tanakh is always, you do this, I do that. And there's no reciprocity here. That makes it almost not a brit. So that's hard. I am not convinced by your understanding of Hakimoti as not meaning established, since this is the first, whatever this is, it's the first one. Where God, I would say, haftacha. This is a promise, and God he's establishing it. He's really promising. So you would have like a word haftacha and lahavtiach, to promise. So once the word brit is kind of odd, then hakimoti, the kiyum, fine. That's also not. That's also queer. Then, just as for wordplay, it's so interesting that, as you said, kare, to cut something like animals in pieces, and that will come at the Brit Bein HaBetachim later on, and that's to cut. So here, though, he does use the word cut in like a very sly way. Is that verse 11? Yeah, he says, "Hakimoti et briti item velo yikaret." He like sneaks that word in. I just wanted to say something about that.
Okay, so that last point, the lo yikaret, that's very sharp, and I never noticed that. Thank you. Your assertion that this is not a breach because it's one-sided, is a correct assertion except for your conclusion, right? Um, Meaning, um, this is the beginning of the evolution of the process of breach. So
Okay.
this breach is one-sided. The next breach is also one-sided. The next breach is the one that Shem establishes with Abraham.
It's conditional on.
No, Brit Ben HaBetarim is not conditional. Brit Ben HaBetarim, there's no agreement. God says it's going to happen. Abraham doesn't need to do anything. He just has to know that things are going to happen.
Okay. All right.
So Brit Ben HaBetarim is also a one-sided Brit, but it's a little bit, he plays a role, but it's a completely passive role, right? There's another one that takes place afterwards, which is Brit Milah, which is the first time we have an active role, and that's the next stage of Brit, but it's still not what we would work for ideally, and we'll get there. So the concept of Brit goes through an evolution. So you're right, you're correct in identifying that this is not what I usually expect from Brit, and you're 100% correct with that. But it is, and Hashem calls it that, and it's one-sided, and you are 100% correct that it's weird that you should have a one-sided Brit.
And just one last point, which has come home to me in these last few years. God is he's promising that he won't destroy the world. But he's not promising that the world cannot be destroyed by someone or something else. Just throwing that out.
Right. I would add, but what he promises over here is that he's not going to uncreate the world again.
You can say it yeah. Well, Mabul, I used to argue that, well, no, he's just promising about using some Mabul, uncreating. And then I decided, well, Mabul is more than flood. It's just uncreating. And then I decided, no, it's just God. He's not promising anything about what human beings do. So I just wanted to leave that there.
Okay. I see two other hands up. We'll listen to both Rona and Sima, and then we're gonna go back to the second piece of what we're gonna do today. Go ahead, Rona.
Just a quick reaction to what you said, Ruth. God can't promise that because of free will. So he won't. He wouldn't do that. A couple of quick points. I think here are animals and people who have survived this horrendous flood. His statement of the covenant, God's statement of the covenant, is just restricted to the waters of a flood. He doesn't say that he won't destroy the world in any other way. He's limiting his commitment. And I think, if I had gone through the trauma that they've gone through, I would have felt very relieved to hear that, But it certainly begs the question, could he do something else? And I find it also very interesting where he says, okay, when I bring cloud, I will remember my covenant between you and every living flesh, so as that the waters will never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. It's almost to me like a human type of comment. I will remember. I mean, it is strange because you don't think he needs a sign, but yet I read it that he does. And I find that puzzling, but kind of fascinating, just from the point of view of God's, let's say, personality, character. So, there.
Thank you.
Doesn't Hashem
And
speak in
finally,
human
Sima.
terms because it makes us
Rose, hold
understand?
on. I think Sima's been waiting.
Yeah.
Sima, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I try to mute when I'm not speaking because other people, sometimes faces come up when people are not muted because there's noise in their background. So I did notice, Ruth, as well as that lo yikarei kol basar. I thought that was so interesting that you pointed that out, Rabbi Grumet, that there was not the lack of the use of Lechrot Brit, but it is in that pasuk. It's fascinating. But one thing that I noticed, and I mentioned it in the document, was and now I think I understand better, was the use of the word not od, but ito, itchem, itchem. So it appears so many times, but maybe, as you said, the important, like in the first pasuk, it's Vayomer Elokim el Noach ve'albanav bito. Why do we need that? Ani hineni makim et biti itchem. B'chol nefesh chaya asher itchem. But maybe it's related to the point that you made that this brit is specifically with Noach and whoever was with him. This oath the oath and the itchem might be somehow related. I know it's the same root, but it's fascinating that itchem, and then you mentioned that oath appears 3 times, and I think if you combine the itchems and the oath, I think it might be 8 times, which is significant. But I'm wondering if there's a literary play here with the itchem and the oath. I just thought it was an interesting point that you made, that this breed is specifically with with whoever was with Noach. And maybe that's the point of the itchem and the oath.
Thank you. It's interesting. As you were talking, and I read the comment that you made on the Google Doc, and I'm thinking in my own head if that same word appears in other places in the Torah where God establishes a brit, and I believe so. So sometimes we have a brit beini uvein,
right?
Is it right? And sometimes hinei briti itach. Okay, my brit is with you.
To see.
Okay, and the itach implies, right? It's interesting that bain is something that is between us, right? It's sort of we remain separate, and then somehow or another there's a little something that connects us. But a briti itcha or itchem, right, is almost like we share a similar fate. I'm just exploring now just a little bit those
right, but what does it mean by
those are the 2 different kinds of words.
What does that mean? The el banav means with him, right? Why do we need that? It's kind of like an
Right. You're asking good questions. You're asking very, very good questions about why that word comes up so frequently here. That's a great observation. Okay. That's the first section. Okay. It's the double section of the brit on the one hand and the oath brit on the other hand. The next section introduces us to a story that we don't understand. And I'm letting you know by the time we finish it, we're not going to understand this story anymore than we understand now. Something about Noach and a vineyard and his sons. And then there's the stuff that we really don't understand is what he does in response. Who did something to Noach? Was it Ham or Canaan? Right? It's unclear. Who did what? Why does meaning that he curses Canaan, whereas as it seems like Ham was the one who had done something to him. There's very strange things happening in there. That's the part I'm not going to because I have not seen any interpretation that makes sense. There are a lot of interpretations. Every one of the Parshanim is bothered by these questions, and they all suggest answers that leave you scratching your head, saying what. So so that part I'm not even going to try to address. But we have the story of Noach himself, and the way the story reads, Noach comes off the teva, he plants a vineyard, he gets drunk, and then one son or grandson, as it might, we don't know, comes in and apparently disgraces him, and the other 2 sons go to protect their father's dignity. But that's the story in a nutshell, which leaves us with lots and lots of questions. Those of you who are familiar with Rashi, who follows the footsteps of the Midrash, see this story as a very harsh critique of Noach. He comes off of the Teva, and the first thing he does is he gets himself drunk. And that's why Noach never ended up being one of the patriarchs. He's sort of relegated to the prehistory of humanity rather than to the early history of the Jewish people. It's an interesting midrashic read. I think it's completely incorrect, just based on a few simple facts. Okay, and somebody pointed this out on the Google Doc, and I thank you for making it so clear and so explicit. When you plant a vineyard, it takes a long time to get drunk. This is not the first thing he did. Right? He had to have eaten something between the time that he came off of the ark and the time that the vineyard had a chance to grow, produce grapes, harvest the grapes, crush the grapes, let them ferment. Right? This is not the first thing he does. So I want to dispel that notion. Right? This is not Noach who just comes off the Teva and is depressed and goes out to the liquor store and buys himself a bottle of cheap whiskey. This story is something completely different. And then the question is, so what is that difference? Okay. So that's what I want to explore a little bit. And I'm going to start by just posing a simple question. Okay, so it's clear that Noach, he comes off, he plants food, he's got to feed himself and his family. Right? There are things growing all over the place. Amongst the things that he plants is a vineyard, which makes sense because he took from each of the plants, each of the seeds from prior to the Mabul, and he plants those. And as we saw last week, that one of the things that really marks the new world from the previous world is that the previous world, God prepared everything and handed it to people on a silver platter, and they didn't know how to take care of it. And in the new world, Noach, coming off of the Teva and having spent a year on that ark, tending to the animals and tending to whatever seedlings and plants he had, so he understands what the role of humans is in a very, very different kind of way, in a very visceral kind of way. So he comes off and he plants lots of things, and there are grapefruits, and there's wheat, and there's lots of other things growing. The Torah chooses to tell us about one story because that one story yielded something else. Okay? So amongst the things that he planted was grapes. And he turns those grapes into wine. And I think there are at least two things to say about them. One is that when God threw the man out of the garden, man turned grain into bread. Right? God made grain. The man transformed the grain, that's the raw material, into bread through a series of processes, right? And bread became the symbol of human creativity. It's what people can do that improves upon the world of nature that God created. That's bread. Okay, and that's going to come up many, many times. It comes up in halacha as well. Bread gets a special bracha, and it gets such a special bracha that the bracha on bread actually covers the entire meal. In fact, bread is so unusual because usually, and if we want to talk for just a minute in the world of halacha, when you take a natural product and you eat it in its natural form, right? I have an orange, so I eat the orange. So the bracha for the orange, borei priya eitz. And if I crush the orange and make orange juice out of it, when I destroy its form, the bracha goes from a more specialized bracha to a more generic kind of bracha. It goes down in status. So the bracha on orange juice is not borei priya eitz. It's shehakol nehiyeh bidvaro. It's a generic bracha. And that's true with with almost all foods. When we destroy the natural product, the nature of the bracha goes from the more specialized to the more generic. The exception is bread. Bread, right, if I take grain, so the bracha on grain is borei pri ha'adama, grows from the ground. Well, I destroy it, I turn it into flour. As plain flour, its bracha is probably shahakol. That sounds strange if you eat raw flour, because it's not the way it's normally eaten. It's not. It's been destroyed. But when I take that flour and I mix it with water and I apply heat to it and I bake it and I turn it into some bread form, it all of a sudden gets the most highly specialized kind of bracha ever. Hamotzi lechem in haaretz. There's only one item that ever gets hamotzi lechem in haaretz, and that's bread. There are lots of things that are borei pri ha'etz. There are lots of things that are borei pri ha'adama, but there's only one bread. So bread is the symbol of human creativity. It turns out that there's a parallel to that in the world of drinks. Because when I crush an orange and I make it into orange juice, the bracha drops. If I take a lemon and I crush it into lemon juice, the bracha drops. Take any fruit and you squeeze it and you get the juice out of it, the bracha becomes the generic bracha, except for grapes. You take the grape and you destroy it and you extract the juice, and especially if you let it ferment, it now becomes borei pri hagafen. It's the only fruit that gets a specialized bracha. So wine is the parallel to bread. Right? Bread and wine symbolize human creativity in the world, right? And what humans can improve on the natural world that God created. So that's observation. And people talk over here about wine and challah for Shabbat, absolutely, and wine and matzah in the Beit HaMikdash with the korbanot, right? Meaning all these things sort of go hand in hand. So that's number one I wanted to point out over here. Noach is doing to grapes the parallel that the first man did to grain. Number one. And now, with that, I ask myself a simple question. So here's Noach. He's repopulating the world. He's reintroduced animals into the world. He's reintroduced plants into the world. And he's sitting there and he's looking at the world that he has created now. He has become Hashem's partner in creation. And he looks at that world and he asks himself, there's something missing here. There's something profound that's missing in this world. It's something that Noach never experienced beforehand, but he certainly heard about. And that's the garden. I go all the way back to creation, back to Perek Beit and Perek Gimel in Breisheet, in the creation. Noach never saw the garden. He didn't meet anybody who saw the garden, but he met people who knew somebody who was in the garden. There's two degrees of separation between Noach and the first man. It's a very simple calculation. You just look at the way the numbers are laid out in one of those genealogical tables at the end of Parashat Breisheet. So Noach's son overlaps with Noach's life. I mean, sorry, meaning Adam's son, not Noah's son. Adam's son overlaps with Noach's life. Okay, so Noach could certainly and probably did hear. I imagine that coming out of the garden, assuming that the garden existed, right? That coming out of the garden, that the man told his children about this place, about this mythical place, this place that we came from, but we can never ever go back to. We saw in Parashat Breisheet that there were a number of attempts to go back to the garden. Cain wanted to go back to the garden. He goes back to the east of Eden, right? And then Hanoch, at least according to the Ibn Ezra and some others, Hanoch managed to get himself back into the garden. The garden existed, if not in reality, it existed certainly as a place that we could go to that will resolve all of our difficulties in this world. That would have been the concept. And with the world being uncreated, garden is gone. There is no place that represents that purity. There is no place that reflects that kind of simplistic, simple and simplistic kind of lifestyle that removes us from the challenges of this world. And that, I believe, is on Noach's mind. How can we live in a world in which there's no possibility to even dream about going back to the garden? Could be they knew that they couldn't do it, but they could dream about it. But if the world's been uncreated and recreated, and Noach is a part of that, so I suspect that one of the things that Noach is very much bothered by is how can we continue in this world without even the dream of being able to go back? And here's what he does. He tries creating his own. So he goes into his tent, which is an enclosed place, like the garden, a gan. A gan is a protected place. He doesn't do this in public. He's in his tent by himself. It's his protected secret space. And what does he do? He tries relieving himself of all the worries in the world. He gets really creative, and he tries using that creativity to release himself, to free his inhibitions. And what that yields is his ability, at least in his own mind, to recreate some facsimile of that garden. And he does that by going back to the same state that the first man and the first woman were in prior to anything that happened. And that was that they were naked. Right? The notion of being naked and not being self-conscious about it. That's the last description the Torah gives us of the garden. Right? V'lo yitboshashu. There was that pure, childish simplicity. And I suspect that's what Noach is trying to recreate. He's trying to recreate the possibility, if not in a physical place, but the possibility of, can I go back? Can I escape from the unbelievable work that's involved in this world? Can I go back and recreate that experience of being in the garden? And that's what he tries to do with the wine. That's not the first thing he does. It takes years till you get the wine, the grapes to produce, and then to harvest them. And even from that point on, it still takes months for them to ferment and become wine. I suspect that that's what Noach is trying to do over here. He's trying to escape from the realities of the world that he created. He doesn't want to do it in front of everybody else, so he goes into his tent. He creates his private protected space. And what happens? One of his sons, walks in and mocks his father. Not for getting drunk. He mocks his father for living in that silly kind of dream of recreating the Garden of Eden. And in that moment, he bursts Noach's bubble. Noach wants nothing more than to recreate some of what used to exist in the world and is missing. And as a creator in this world, he says, we need that. We can't survive in this world without the ability to escape. And his son or his grandson, whoever it is, Ham, Canaan, they somehow or another get all intertwined. It doesn't make a difference. The Torah is ambiguous about it. Maybe it wants to be ambiguous about it, right? But they go and they mock him. Get real, Dad. And Noah cannot forgive him for that. And that's what happens in the opening of that story. The other two brothers, they try to protect their father's dignity. Okay, both on a simplistic level of covering him up, but also, okay, Dad did something, he tried accomplishing something, and let's protect his dignity. But that's what I think this story is here for. This is the reaction of people who have gone through, and he wants to take with him something from that old country. There was something from his childhood, something from his youth. There was something about the dream of whatever it is that he wants to recreate. The net result of all that is that Noah ends up doing something, and I'm going to pose this as a question. He ends up doing something that we've never seen before. Up until this point, it's God who gives out brachot, and God who gives out arur, right? The diminishing of potential, right? We saw it in creation. We saw it in God's relationship with the man and the woman when they left the garden. We saw it with God and Cain. We saw it with God and Noah at the end of the Mabul, right? He gives them a bracha of pru'urvu all over again. And here Noah does it. Noah gives an arur to his son/grandson, and Noah gives brachot to the other two sons, to Shem and to Yefet. And Noah is doing a godly thing. And now I ask the question, is that positive or negative? Is this something that Noah is to be applauded for? Or is this something for Noah to be critiqued about? Okay, I'm going to toss that out there, give people a chance to think, and while you're thinking, we have a few comments over here. I think Sima has her hand up, Rona has her hand up, and Ruth has her hand up. So let's start with Sima.
I'm wondering if to support. I love this theory. It's a lot to think about. Very, very unique. And I'm wondering if the text supports your theory a little bit by using the word vayita karem. He plants a karem. I think that's I don't have a concordance in front of me, but the only other time that I can remember vayita is in Vayita Hashem Elokim Gan Be'eden Mikedem. I don't know if there's another time that vayita is used between these two stories, but maybe that's a little bit of a connection between what Noah was trying to do by plant a karem and to kind of recreate that gan. The last time the word vayita was used.
Thank you. That's very interesting. It is used again afterwards, but I don't think it's used anywhere in between. Okay. Rona, go ahead.
I find your interpretation quite interesting, kind of from a fictional point of view. Where do you see that in the text? Is there anything in the text that gives you a clue that he was missing the garden and that he was trying to compensate for that?
The only thing I don't see any direct hints in the text.
Okay.
What I do see is he insists on doing this inside his tent.
Yeah.
Okay, which reminds me of the Gan, right?
Okay.
A protected area.
Okay.
And the getting naked
Yeah, that is very
seems
interesting.
to
The
be
naked.
intentional,
Yeah,
right? It's not an accident. And it's not a sexual thing. He's by
no,
himself.
right. Now it seemed to be that he uncovered himself after he was drunk. I mean, it is following. So, was he totally conscious of it? But okay, I'll just leave that aside. And I also wanted to know, where do you see that um, the son mocked him? Was it that he told his two brothers? That Ham told his two brothers?
Yeah, just based on
Hmm.
uh, look, the way the text reads, it says Ham saw and told his two brothers.
Yeah, yeah.
When Noah wakes up, he realizes what his son had done to him,
That he was gossiping about him, or
right? So whatever
yeah.
it was,
Hmm.
right? The way the text describes it, it simply says he told them. But
Okay.
apparently, there was something more than just the telling.
I see.
The telling itself was something that Noah understood was a very negative thing.
Okay.
Again, if you take a look at Chazal have all sorts of other interpretations as to what Ham had done to him, and
Mm.
they speak about different kinds of actions because it uses the word asa. Okay, and I think when we look at the text itself seems to suggest that whatever it was that he did was in the telling.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
I want to move on because I'm conscious of the time. You have Ruth, and then Deborah, and then Ellen. Go ahead.
Okay. So yes, I completely agree with you about and the your interpretation with some tweaks. Yes, and all of that, there's so many linguistic hints in the paragraph, which just links it right back to the gan. And it does start with Sima, it does start with Vayita. He plants, but this is a failed gan. It's the gan is an orchard, and he doesn't plant trees. He plants low, twisted, you see when you see grapevines growing, they have to be supported, and they're ugly, really. They're like twisted and bent and not gnarly. They're not beautiful, upstanding trees. So that's point one, that we're in a failed garden. He's trying, he wants to recreate it, but he's failing at every step. Poor Noah. And the the drinking of the wine in Vayishaker, that's the recreation of the status of Adam and Ish and Isha, that they are lo yitbashoshu. They were not inhibited. They were uninhibited. Nothing. There was just that's it. Imbibing leads to lack inhibition, no inhibitions. And then I love this Vayitgal, which is a play on words of hitgalut. He's looking for that the revelation of the divine presence that was there in the real Gan, and but it's but there's some letters missing, so it's just Vayitgal, but it's almost Hitgalut, but not. And then Betoch Ohala, yes. So I can go along with your tent, but the Ohel also brings up the image of the future of the Ohel Moed, which is where the divine presence is, which is where the Gan, which it's in the Gan. It's all trying to be the original Gan, but it isn't. And then not only does he experiences erva, and then although there's no parallel to what the brothers do, but there is the action of covering it up as God. They tried to cover themselves up, and then God makes them more better clothing. And that's exactly what happens here. The brothers, they try to cover him up with a fling of a blanket like that, which it doesn't do anything. And so, and I don't see the brothers' action as being positive. I see that being as more like negative. They're walking backwards, but you can't walk backwards unless you look over your shoulder to see where you're going. So they are looking while they're potentially saying they're walking backwards so that they shouldn't see, as the Midrashim explain this, but they're actually looking backwards, and they're throwing a cover over the whole issue, the scene of walking backwards, which is ineffectual, and without looking, tossing a blanket over backwards is also ineffectual. So what are they really doing? So we can just dot that. But yes, it's the Gan Redux, but really bad. Thanks.
Okay. I see that some more hands here. We'll take 3 more comments and then I want to close. Okay, Deborah, and then Ellen, and then Wendy.
Sure. To your question about the Arur and Baruch, I was thinking that, the fact that Noach is able to hand out either a klala or a bracha, a curse or a blessing, following the line of thinking that mankind is now involved in being creative and continuing the creation, he is now exemplifying some of God's characteristics. So now he too can hand out blessings, curses. It's part of being part of the creative process.
Okay. Thank you. Ellen?
So we learned early on that it's terrible for man to be alone. Like Hashem tells him that. And okay, he creates a wife, but then he seemed to have this camaraderie with the animals. So Adam wasn't so alone, but Noach must have been the most lonely human being ever in history. He came from a world where he had lots of peers and suddenly nobody. There's just his wife and his children. And we don't know how long his wife lived or what sort of relationship they had. He doesn't have this camaraderie with the animals anymore. And it must have been horrendous. And I guess Gan Eden was the closest thing to man being alone that he could recall from stories or whatever. And somehow, man seemed happy in those days. So he was hoping to get some relief from this profound loneliness, I think.
Interesting. Thank you for that insight. Okay, Wendy, and I see Chaim has joined the list of those who went. So Chaim's going to be the last comment. Go ahead, Wendy.
Okay, just 2 quick things. One is building on what Ruthie said. I don't see that the fact that we're told that Noah built planted a vine means that he didn't plant everything else. So I'm still okay with your very interesting interpretation, I have to say. Okay. But then I'm thinking about, but then your question about, was that something positive or negative that Noah did? I think I agree with whoever said, I think it was Deborah who said that now he sees himself differently. We saw that after, like he gave a korban. He realized that he is now, after the Mabul, he is different than animals. He's on a different level. But he still recognizes here that he's not God, because even though he might give out a blessing or a curse, he still invokes God's name. He doesn't believe he has the power to change it. It's almost like a wish expressing, I'm hoping that Hashem will use his powers and whatever so that such and such happens. So I see it as a win for Noah.
Okay, thank you. Chaim, our closing comment.
Could we, just as you said, that Brit is an evolving process, that in fact consciousness of God is an evolving process, that we were in Gan Eden, and he's trying to find a way to recreate a sense of consciousness of God, of being creative. Netilat yadayim means to take your hands and be like God and create. And this is one step in the direction of Avraham, but we have another step in between, and that is Migdal Bavel. So there's increasing, I like to think of we got thrown out of Gan Eden because of God envy. Then we ate from the Eitz Hadas. We thought we were God. And the recognition of God being God, and we want to emulate and be conscious of God. And this is a step in the process. And he used wine, which is like all psychedelics or drugs, can increase the consciousness to God, but it didn't make it. Migdal Bavel didn't make it because they were too full of themselves. only by Avraham did he begin to hear God or be conscious of God without wine or having to take over from God.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you. Okay, I'm looking at the clock. We have actually 2 psukim to finish this passage, but I don't think we have time right now to learn those 2 psukim. So we're going to save them for the beginning of next week. And that'll be the beginning of next week is going to be the close of what we're going to do today. And then the bulk of next week's shiur is going to be on chapter 10, Perek Yud, in its entirety. Okay, there's a lot of interesting things. As we've looked in the past at genealogical lists, and we saw interesting things. There are a lot of interesting things in what's called the Table of Nations of chapter 10 of Perek Yud, and as you go through it, try to notice some of those interesting things. I'd like to hear what you found. So have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you next Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.